Welcome to Vision. Today on the deep dive, we're plunging into, well, a really significant shift happening right now in the global automobile industry. We're turning our attention to some of the most famous names in the game, the Japanese car makers, and unpacking the very real challenges they're navigating.
That's right. We've been looking through quite a bit of material articles, discussions, reports, and they really highlight this dynamic shift. Companies that were once seen as practically untouchable, certainly in some areas of the market, are now facing some pretty intense pressure from new directions too.
And our mission for this deep dive is, well, pretty simple.
Huh.
To really get to the core of why. Why are Japanese car makers facing these headwinds? What do the sources say about the potential future? And basically pull out the absolute most important insights for you from all of this material we've gathered.
Yeah, I mean, think about it historically. For decades, Japanese cars weren't just cars, were they? They were symbols. Reliability, fuel efficiency, value, they absolutely dominated markets worldwide, completely changing the game for, the older manufacturers.
Okay, let's anchor that history a bit. If you remember the 1970s and 80s, Japanese brands were just everywhere. They didn't just show up, they came in and really aggressively challenged the established players in places like Europe and the US.
And a huge part of that initial success, as highlighted in the material, was, well, pure timing and some really clever engineering, wasn't it? When the oil crisis hit in the early 70s, sending gas prices just through the roof.
Right.
Japanese automakers already had these incredibly economical vehicles ready to go. They developed them under, tight constraints back home.
Exactly. Those fuel-efficient cars were precisely what buyers in North America suddenly needed. That timing was just perfect. It gave them a crucial foothold in the U.S. market that they just built on for years and years.
Leading to that global reputation for, bulletproof reliability by the 80s.
Yeah. But if you fast forward to today,
Yeah.
well, yeah, okay, 3 of the 10 largest car producers globally are still Japanese. That's true. But the material definitely points to some clear signs
Yeah.
that they're losing that once sharp edge.
And where is this loss of edge most visible? The sources really point towards Asia.
Which is huge, right?
Massive. It
Right.
accounts for over 50% of global passenger car sales. And the sources show Japanese car makers have lost substantial market share. We're talking places like China, Indonesia, Thailand, even Singapore, just in the last 5 years alone. That's a big deal.
That's huge. It really is.
And just look at the global production rankings. Back in, say, 1998, Japan was the world leader, making about a tenth of all passenger cars.
Wow.
Today. That figure has fallen by almost half. It just signals a really fundamental shift.
Okay, so what's driving this? Why the struggle now? The sources seem to point to a couple of massive interconnected reasons. The first major one seems to be their approach or maybe missteps in the global race towards electrification.
Yeah, and this is fascinating because, maybe surprisingly, Nissan was actually an early pioneer here, weren't they?
Right, the Nissan Leaf.
Exactly. They released the all-electric Nissan Leaf way back in 2010, and it was genuinely popular, sold in around 60 markets globally.
So you'd think they'd have this massive head start, right? Build on that.
You would think. But the analysis in the material suggests maybe Nissan was actually too early.
Too early. How does that work?
Well, the argument goes that because demand for hybrids and traditional gas engines remained pretty strong in the years after the Leaf launched, they didn't quite follow up effectively. They didn't maybe capture the market at the right time with the right next-gen battery EV product, the right price, the right supply chain, to really build on that early lead.
Ah, okay. So the initial momentum kind of stalled a bit, perhaps.
That seems to be the argument. Meanwhile, you have a giant like Toyota taking a different path.
Right. Their strategy, as the sources describe it, was much broader.
Yeah, to offer a wide portfolio. Gasoline hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and battery EVs. Kind of a hedge-your-bets approach.
Which, sounds logical on paper. Give customers lots of choices.
It does. But the issue the material highlights is that Toyota has specifically fallen short on having the right battery-based EV at the right price point to truly compete effectively in what's now a rapidly accelerating pure EV segment.
Gotcha. It's like having lots of tools, maybe, but not the sharpest one for the job that's suddenly most in demand.
Exactly. And that brings us neatly to The second, perhaps even bigger disruptive force identified in the sources,
Boy, yes.
the explosive rise of Chinese car makers. Remember that chart showing Japan losing its #1 production spot?
China took it. Right.
China took it. And the sources put a huge spotlight on one company in particular, BYD.
Okay.
It's described as a company many people had never heard of a few years ago, but it's almost single-handedly driven much of China's incredible growth in this EV space.
Right. And there's that anecdote about Elon Musk, isn't there?
Yeah, that's in the sources too. Back in a 2011 interview, someone asked him about BYD, and apparently he just sort of chuckled and said something like, "Have you seen their car?" The implication being, they weren't sophisticated, small, boxy.
Wow. And that was just over a decade ago. It's almost hard to believe.
It really is, because today the picture is just dramatically different. BYD isn't just a competitor, they are a global leader. The sources point out that in just the fourth quarter of last year, BYD actually outsold Tesla globally
Wow.
by something like 42,000 pure EVs. They've even been described, maybe a bit dramatically, as having out-Tesla'd Tesla in terms of sheer scale and speed of execution.
Out-Tesla'd Tesla. That's quite a phrase. So what's behind that success?
Well, one of the key factors the sources highlight for BYD's incredible success, and really the success of other Chinese automakers too, to varying degrees, is their ability to offer electric cars across all price points.
Oh, okay. So not just high-end.
No, from entry-level city cars right up to more premium segments. They have competitive, often really feature-rich options across the board.
And that must put huge pressure on established players, especially in certain markets.
Absolutely. This rapid ascent of players like BYD means they can quickly overshadow, say, smaller Japanese rivals. And it contributes significantly to that market share loss we were talking about earlier.
Especially in those price-sensitive, high-volume markets in Asia.
Exactly. So this whole context, this pressure and disruption, it's really what drives some of the corporate dramas we've been seeing. The sources really caution that, complacency is just not an option anymore.
And Nissan, in particular, seems to have faced some very public struggles. They've grappled with keeping their competitive edge, especially since the tumultuous departure of former chairman Carlos Ghosn.
Right. Remember him, known for that high-volume sales strategy. Then the dramatic arrest in Tokyo, fleeing to Lebanon, while denying wrongdoing, of course. That whole saga.
Yeah, quite the story.
And following that period, Nissan embarked on a pretty significant cost-cutting program, a 3-year plan. And the sources recount a particularly disastrous day in November 2024.
What happened then?
Nissan announced these drastic cuts, 9,000 jobs globally, and shutting down a fifth of their manufacturing capacity, all due to, plummeting sales and profits.
Wow, 9,000 jobs and a fifth of capacity. That really underscores the depth of the challenge they were facing.
It really does. And it's against this backdrop, this struggle, that something pretty extraordinary happened just a month later.
Okay.
Honda entered the picture, and the two companies, Nissan and Honda, longtime rivals, began formal talks.
Talks about what? A partnership.
Potentially a wide-ranging partnership, or even exploring a full merger under, a holding company structure.
Honda and Nissan. Wow, that would have been huge.
Huge. And the material makes it pretty clear these talks were born out of necessity, really. A defensive move.
To compete better.
Yeah, the idea was pooling resources, sharing the absolutely massive costs of R&D for future EVs, maybe integrating cultures, supply chains, to stand a better chance against these new global powerhouses.
Makes sense.
Although some commentators in the sources even described it as a desperate move.
Really? Why desperate?
Well, noting that both companies operate in many of the same markets, and maybe crucially, were widely seen as already being a bit behind in the pure EV race.
Ah, I see. So, pooling resources from a position of perceived weakness, perhaps?
Kind of. And then just recently, this February, the talks concluded.
With a deal.
No, not with a grand merger announcement, with a decision not to proceed with the deal.
Oh.
And this happened around the same time Nissan issued another revised lower operating income forecast.
So it highlights just how difficult these strategic shifts and collaborations can be, even when they seem necessary.
Absolutely, even when born out of need.
Okay, so seeing all this unfold in the source materials is one thing, but it's always fascinating to see how people react to these stories, right?
Yeah.
Especially online.
Definitely. And looking at the comments section of one of the source videos we reviewed really highlighted some interesting perspectives.
Yeah. What stood out?
Well, one theme that came up over and over was people questioning the word threat.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, comments asking, wait, when did competition become a threat? Or just saying, threat is the wrong way to frame it. It's just competition.
And that point resonates even more when you think historically, doesn't it?
Totally. As one commenter put it brilliantly, I thought, did they call it Japanese threat 50 years ago?
Huh. Good point.
Mm.
It really highlights how the language shifts depending on who's doing the disrupting.
Exactly. And tied to that, you saw comments that just cut right to like fundamental market dynamics, ideas like the market decides who survives, or that the company with the best car in the cheapest price will win this race.
A very pure, almost textbook view of competition. Succeed or fail based on your product and price, not whether you're perceived as a threat by established players.
Right. What was also quite striking was the sense of irony noted by some commenters.
Irony how?
Well, people who maybe used to look down on made in China as, cheap or low quality,
Yeah.
now seeing China outcompete on quality and innovation, specifically in EVs, and suddenly that's framed as a threat.
Yeah, I can see that.
Huh.
And did that lead to discussions about protectionism?
It did. There were comments mentioning import taxes and tariffs, say in the U.S., protecting domestic car makers, and questioning whether politics or unions or lobbyists are even preventing consumers in places like America from experiencing BYD's price points or quality directly.
So it broadened the lens, doesn't it? Beyond just the car maker's actions to the external market forces and political factors at play.
Absolutely. And another related observation was just about the media framing itself.
How so?
Someone noted that titles involving China often seem to include the word threat. It just shows people are critically evaluating not just the news, but how it's being presented to them.
That's insightful. Okay, so beyond the framing, were there direct critiques of the analysis itself, like challenging the points made in the source video?
Oh, yeah, definitely, which is great to see, right? Real engagement. For example, someone took issue with that idea. We discussed that Nissan was simply too early with the Leaf.
Okay, what was their take?
Their argument was it wasn't just about timing. It was more a failure to continuously innovate and build a really robust supply chain specifically for EVs after that initial launch.
So more of a strategic execution problem than just bad timing.
That was their view, yeah. Seeing it as dropping the ball after a good start.
Interesting. Any other critiques like that?
Well, someone drew an interesting analogy comparing Elon Musk's early dismissal of BYD to how Microsoft's CEO, Steve Ballmer, initially reacted to the iPhone back in 2007.
Oh, yeah, laughing it off.
Pretty much. Maybe underestimating a truly disruptive force until it's, well, almost too late. It's a classic pattern, potentially.
And did listeners bring in other factors maybe not fully explored in the main analysis?
They did. People brought up things like the quality and features maybe slipping in the Japanese domestic market itself, suggesting maybe recent trends there haven't kept pace globally, and that this intense Chinese competition could actually be the wake-up call needed.
Okay. What else?
And the role of innovation beyond just the finished car was highlighted, particularly China's rapid advancements in battery technology. From companies like CATL and BYD themselves, maybe outpacing traditional battery partners like Panasonic.
Right, the battery is key.
Crucial. And also the focus by Chinese automakers on seamlessly integrating cars with consumer electronics, phones, apps, screens. That's a huge differentiator for many buyers today.
Yeah, the whole in-car tech experience.
Exactly. Someone even mentioned new tech companies like Xiaomi getting into the car market now in China.
Wow. So it really shows just how many layers there are to this massive shift.
Definitely. And across all these comments, you really saw diverse views on Japan's future path. It wasn't monolithic at all.
Like what?
Well, some commenters were quite skeptical that Japanese manufacturers would fully embrace pure EVs in a big way, saying things like, Japanese manufacturers are not going to be confused by your trends, suggesting they'll stick to hybrids or hydrogen, maybe.
Interesting. A different strategic bet.
Yeah. While others saw the potential for them to fall into the classic innovator's dilemma.
Explain that again.
It's that common business trap, right? Where successful companies, they struggle to switch focus to a new disruptive technology because they're just so good, so invested in their old one.
Until the new technology overtakes them.
Exactly. And it's seen as a risk factor for many established players globally in this transition, not just Japanese ones.
Okay, so yes, the analysis from the sources points to significant challenges, some really tough corporate moments.
Yeah.
But you're saying it's definitely not all doom and gloom for these Japanese giants.
No, absolutely not. That's a crucial point. The sources also highlight signs of hope and, importantly, adaptation.
Okay, like what?
Well, despite being fierce rivals for decades, Japanese companies are actually starting to collaborate in new ways. Out of necessity, perhaps, but they're doing it.
Right. We saw that the Honda-Nissan talks didn't proceed, but other collaborations are happening.
Yes. Things like sharing expensive software development platforms, collaborating on really cutting-edge R&D, that stuff is happening.
And what kind of R&D?
Well, Toyota and Nissan, for instance, are putting a lot of focus and presumably resources into solid-state battery technology.
Ah, solid state. That's seen as the next big thing, isn't it?
It could be a game changer, yeah, if they can perfect it and scale it up. Solid-state batteries promise some significant improvements.
Okay.
Potentially cheaper to manufacture in the long run, offering much longer driving range, and, crucially, charging significantly faster than the current lithium-ion batteries most EVs use today.
Okay, so mastering that could give them a real edge again.
It could. And of course, you just can't discount the sheer scale and the engineering prowess of a company like Toyota. They remain, by quite a considerable margin, the largest car producer in the world.
That's true.
As the source material puts it, it's just hard to think that a company of that size and capability simply won't exist or won't find a way forward in the future.
Yeah, fair point. They have deep resources.
And ultimately, the material really emphasizes that while we're focusing on Japan here, the threat or the challenge, if you prefer that word that they face, isn't unique to them. It's really not any different from what major established automakers like Volkswagen in Europe or Ford and GM in the US are also experiencing.
So it's a global industry transformation we're witnessing.
Absolutely. It's about established players, all of them, needing to adapt rapidly to this really disruptive change. Change driven by new technology like EVs and by these new, incredibly agile and competitive market entrants, especially from China.
Okay. So let's recap the journey then. We've gone from that era of Japanese car dominance, built on timely efficiency and legendary reliability,
Mhm.
through to the current struggles, marked by difficult strategic choices around electrification, the explosive arrival of powerful new competitors like BYD,
Right.
and those very public corporate dramas like the attempted but ultimately failed Honda-Nissan partnership talks.
Yeah. And we've also folded in that really valuable perspective from people reacting to this story online, questioning the language of threat, highlighting the raw dynamics of market competition, pointing out specific areas of innovation in batteries and tech integration.
And offering those alternative ideas about the best path forward, whether it's pure EV, hybrid, or something else.
And despite all those challenges, the sources clearly show those seeds of adaptation are there. Rivals collaborating, big R&D pushes into next-gen tech like solid-state batteries, and of course, the undeniable enduring scale of companies like Toyota.
So, this deep dive into the source material really leaves us with the central question posed within it. And it's something significant for you, the listener, to consider. Can Japanese automakers, and frankly all the established players facing this immense pressure, truly embrace this era of change? Can they bring in fresh ideas? And then, maybe crucially, can they do what they were once absolute masters at perfecting those ideas and processes to remain relevant and, indeed, thrive in the coming years and decades?
It's a huge test, not just for them, but for the entire global auto industry.